Welcome to Life Stories, where we share powerful, transformative tales that inspire change and encourage self-discovery. Today, we bring you a story of strength, resilience, and the courage to start over. After years of sacrifice and neglect, one woman finally chooses herself, walking away from a life she once thought she could never escape. This is a journey of self-liberation, of letting go of the past, and embracing a future filled with endless possibilities. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to begin today's story. Let's dive into this remarkable journey together. For years, I gave everything to my family, my husband, Mark, my son, Samuel, and even his daughter, Lily. Every day was a repetitive cycle of exhaustion and unmet needs. Mark, a man who once promised to love me forever, became a shadow of the person I married. It wasn't that he was cruel, but rather, he had simply stopped seeing me. He never truly saw me for who I was, or for the sacrifices I made. I was a mother, a wife, a caretaker, and above all, a constant source of support for everyone in the household. But as time went on, I started to notice that my efforts were taken for granted. It seemed as if my family felt entitled to the life I was providing for them, while I was left to wither away, unnoticed. And the more I gave, the more they took. After work, Samuel would come home, demanding that I take care of Lily, who was already expecting me to pick her up from school. But my son, who had more free time than I did, was always too busy. He would scold me. "Mom, you're at home all day. Why can't you do more?" I would endure the criticism, as I always did. No one ever took the time to consider that I was drowning in the responsibilities they were throwing my way. But what broke me, what made my patience snap like a brittle twig, was the day I saw Mark, the man I had given my heart to, act so tenderly with someone else. His first love, Linda, now sick with Alzheimer's, was the object of his affection. And there he was, gently combing her hair, buying her dresses, singing songs to her. I watched this, my heart breaking as I realized that all the love I had poured into him, all the years I spent cooking, cleaning, and keeping the house in order, had been overshadowed by the smallest of gestures towards Linda. I was invisible in my own home, a mere backdrop to their reunion. It wasn't just the small things that hurt, though. It was the big things, the years of neglect and emotional abandonment. I spent my days in the kitchen, cooking meals for a family that barely acknowledged my efforts. All those hours of work, of love, were ultimately trumped by a few leftovers that Mark handed to Linda as if that was enough to make up for everything I had given up. That was the moment I realized something had to change. I was done. I was done playing the part of the martyr, the one who silently endured in the name of family. I packed my bags, put down my spatula, and left. I know they thought I couldn't live without them, that I'd never make it on my own. But the truth was, it was them who couldn't live without me. They were just too blind to see it. As I walked out the door, the weight of years of sacrifice lifted from my shoulders. I stepped into a world of possibilities, where no one was waiting for me to pick up the pieces. I was free. As I traveled, met new people, and tried new things, I felt alive again. It was as if a part of me that had been dormant for years had been awakened. I made videos with young people, laughed, and explored new places. It was everything I had been missing. Meanwhile, back at home, Mark struggled to keep things together. He thought he could handle Linda's illness on his own, but the reality of caring for her broke him. He was overwhelmed, and in the end, he regretted everything. He called for me to come back, but there was no turning back for me. I had made my choice. I was finally living for myself, and there was no way I was going back to that life, no matter how much they tried to convince me otherwise. For the first time in years, I found myself waking up in the mornings with a sense of purpose, a lightness I hadn't felt in decades. There were no demands waiting for me, no chores piling up, no expectations for me to meet. The silence in my new apartment felt strange, but peaceful. I no longer had to put on a brave face or hide my exhaustion behind a smile. The freedom was intoxicating, and for the first time, I was truly living for myself. I traveled to new places, met people who were full of life, and found joy in things I had long since forgotten. I took long walks in the park, just to clear my head, and sat in cafes, savoring the simple pleasure of a cup of coffee without anyone needing anything from me. I started doing things I never thought I would, things that made me feel alive again. I learned how to make videos, something I'd never imagined myself doing, and it felt exhilarating. But the road to freedom wasn't without its bumps. Samuel, my son, could not understand why I had left. He called me frequently, trying to convince me to return to Mark and help care for Linda. He didn't see what I saw. He didn't understand the years of emotional labor I had poured into that family, only to be discarded. Mom, you can't just leave Dad alone like that. How could you do this to the family? He would say, his voice filled with frustration and confusion. I didn't have the energy to argue with him anymore. I wasn't going back to that life, and I had made peace with that. He didn't understand, and maybe he never would. But for once, I wasn't worried about what anyone thought of me. I wasn't carrying the weight of their expectations anymore. I focused on myself, and for the first time in my life, I did not feel guilty about it. I started making friends, especially with younger people who had a fresh perspective on life. They taught me to see the world through a different lens. Together, we explored new places, took pictures, and created memories. I laughed like I hadn't in years. It was as if the years of sacrifice had been wiped away by the sheer joy of rediscovery. One day, I was sitting in a small cafe when a group of students came up to me. They asked if I would help them with a project they were working on for their photography class. They were eager to share their ideas with me, and I was just as eager to help. It felt good to be wanted, not out of obligation, but because they genuinely appreciated my company. We spent hours together, talking about life, love, and everything in between. For the first time, I felt like I belonged to something bigger than just my past. But no matter how much I tried to move forward, the past kept creeping up on me. Every time I would post a photo or video on social media, I would receive messages from Mark, asking me to come back. He sent me flowers, more flowers than I had ever received in our entire marriage. But it wasn't about the flowers or the words anymore. He was trying to prove something to me. But I couldn't ignore the years of neglect. The way he had never truly seen me. I knew that I couldn't let myself be pulled back into that life. I had to move forward, no matter how difficult it was. I wasn't going to be the woman who waited for someone else to change. I was going to change for myself. The days after I left Mark were filled with a sense of freedom. But they also brought a flood of memories, memories of a life I once shared with him. I would be lying if I said I didn't feel a twinge of sadness when I thought about those years. It wasn't just about the bad times. There were moments of warmth, of laughter, of love, too. I had tried to hold on to those, but they always seemed to get overshadowed by the weight of everything else. And now, with him gone, I had to confront the fact that I no longer had the strength to go back. One evening, as I sat in my new apartment, the phone rang. It was Jorge, my son. He told me that Mark was in the hospital. Apparently, he had taken ill, and they weren't sure how serious it was. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. A part of me was afraid of how I would react, but another part of me simply didn't care. I had moved on, hadn't I? Despite my reluctance, I decided to visit him. I didn't know why, but something deep inside told me that I should. When I arrived at the hospital, I saw him lying there, fragile and pale. His hair had grown long, his face tired and haggard. For a moment, I didn't know how to feel. I had lived without him for so long. And here he was, so small, so helpless. He didn't notice me at first. His eyes closed as he slept fitfully. But when he woke, his gaze landed on me, and his face softened. "Vivian," he whispered, his voice weak. "You came." I sat beside him, but I couldn't bring myself to say much. The man I had once shared a life with was lying there before me. And yet, I felt no warmth. I didn't feel anger, either, or regret, just a profound emptiness. We were strangers now, bound only by history. His eyes searched mine, as if looking for something. Some spark of affection, but I had none left to give. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice trembling. "I've hurt you more than I can ever apologize for." His words struck me, but not in the way I expected. I had spent so many years waiting for him to say those words. For him to acknowledge all the pain I had carried. But now that he said them, they felt hollow, like the last-ditch effort to make up for a lifetime of neglect. "What about Linda?" I asked, my voice steady. "What about her?" He hesitated, his face contorting with confusion and guilt. I sent her to a nursing home." He confessed quietly. "I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't care for her the way you did. It was too much." I looked at him for a long moment, my mind racing. He had taken care of Linda for so long. But when it came down to it, he couldn't handle the burden. Just as he had failed to see my struggles all those years. He had failed to see the weight Linda had carried. And now, here we were, two people who had once loved each other, but who had grown so distant that neither of us knew how to fix it. I felt nothing, no satisfaction, no sense of vindication, just emptiness. The years of sacrifice, the pain, the frustration, it all melted away in that moment. Mark wasn't the man I once knew. And I wasn't the woman who had stayed by his side through it all. I had changed. I had learned that I was worthy of more than just being the silent, patient caregiver. "I've let you down, Vivian," he murmured, his eyes welling with tears. But I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for him anymore. He had made his choices, just as I had made mine. I stood up, my legs trembling slightly. "It's too late," I said softly. "You had your chance to change. But you never did. I can't fix that for you now." With that, I left. I didn't look back. 2 months after our divorce, I received a call from Jorge, telling me that Mark had passed away. The news didn't affect me the way I thought it would. I had spent so many years resenting him. But in the end, I felt nothing but a quiet sense of closure. Mark was gone, and I had finally stepped out from under his shadow. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized something important. I had spent so many years looking for love, for validation from those around me. But I had finally learned that the most important love of all was the love I gave to myself. I had been so focused on what I owed to others. I had forgotten about what I owed to myself. I had spent decades giving everything to my family, to my husband, to my son, and in return, I had received nothing but exhaustion and neglect. But now, I was free. I was free to live for myself, to do the things I had always wanted to do. I wasn't a martyr anymore. I was just me, Vivian, a woman who had learned that it's never too late to choose a new path. As the days passed, I found peace in the life I was creating for myself. I no longer lived in the shadow of my past or the expectations of others. I had learned the hard way that love should never be one-sided. And that self-love was not selfish, but essential. I was no longer defined by my relationships with Mark or Samuel. I was my own person, free to chase my dreams, to live a life I had once thought was beyond my reach. I traveled more, exploring new places, meeting new people, and embracing every moment. I found joy in the simple things, the laughter of friends, the quiet of the early mornings, the beauty of the world around me. It was a life I had earned, a life that was truly mine. And as I continued to share my journey through videos and social media, I realized that my story resonated with many others. People reached out, telling me how my experiences had inspired them to take control of their own lives. It was more than I had ever hoped for. When I look back at the years I spent with Mark, I don't feel anger anymore. I feel gratitude for the lessons I learned, for the strength I discovered within myself. Sometimes, it's in the hardest moments that we find our true power. Life may not always be easy, but it is ours to shape, to live, and to cherish. Thank you for following my story. If you found inspiration in it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more life stories. Your journey is just beginning. And remember, it's never too late to choose a new path.